Okay, I want you to picture this. It's December 1st, 1944. You're standing on a bitterly cold German hilltop, just northeast of a little town called Beck. Up there with you is Lieutenant Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion. He's squinting through the M76F telescopic sight of his M36 Jackson tank destroyer, scanning miles and miles of flat, open terrain deep into German-held territory. Suddenly he spots a target, but it's not just any target, and it is certainly not at a normal, everyday combat distance. What he's looking at is a German Panther tank just cruising along a distant highway. Now Rose checks the range markings etched into his glass reticle. And get this, the tank aligns perfectly with the very last line at the very bottom of his scale. 4,600 yards. That is, no joke, 2.61 miles away. Just to put that into perspective, there were absolutely no training manuals for this. I mean, no American crew had ever engaged a target at anything even close to that range in direct fire. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer absurdity of that distance. Your standard American Sherman tank, they were fighting at combat ranges of about 500 yards. Even the doctrine for the brand new M36 Jackson only called for engagements up to 1,500 yards. And here is Rose, looking at a target at 4,600 yards. He's literally more than tripling the standard engagement range, aiming at a tiny dot so far away that his sight practically can't even measure anything past it.
So you might be wondering, why on earth would he even attempt a shot like this? Well, to understand that, we need to talk about the terrifying reality of German armor at the time. The Americans were facing a desperate situation in late November 1944. They had a massive Panther problem. The German Panther tank was, for all intents and purposes, a rolling fortress. It had 85 millimeters of frontal armor, but it was angled at a steep 55 degrees. That slope effectively increased its thickness to nearly 140 millimeters. On the flip side, the standard American Sherman was rocking a 75 millimeter gun that was completely and utterly ineffective against that sloped front at any practical combat range.
And it gets worse. Even when the Americans tried to upgrade their firepower to 76 millimeter guns, they ran headfirst into this horrifying phenomenon known as the shatter gap. Basically, if they fired from beyond 400 meters, the tip of the American shell would simply deform and shatter against the Panther's face-hardened armor before it could even penetrate. The guns were literally failing in the field. The armor was just too tough.
Which leads us to some truly brutal arithmetic. A Panther could easily spot and destroy a Sherman from 1,200 yards out. But for an American crew to have even a sliver of a chance at a frontal kill, they had to close the distance to 500 yards or less. Most crews making that absolutely suicidal 700-yard sprint, they didn't survive the approach because the Panther always spotted them first, and the Panther always fired first.
Okay, let's dive into this mechanical solution that the Army finally rolled out to try and level the playing field.
Enter the M36 Jackson. This machine was a real game changer. They took a massive 90mm M3 gun, which, by the way, was originally adapted from an anti-aircraft weapon, and just dropped it right onto a proven M10A1 chassis. For the first time, an American vehicle could penetrate 5.6 inches of armor at 1,500 yards. It was the very first Allied tank destroyer that could actually threaten a Panther's front at realistic combat ranges. But of course, it came with a catch. The M36 was a massive tactical gamble. To save on weight and give the commander unparalleled visibility, the turret was completely open top, like no roof whatsoever. That meant the 5-man crew was entirely exposed to airburst artillery, mortars, you name it. And think about the stakes here. Firing that massive 90mm gun from an elevated hilltop would create a muzzle flash visible for miles. Taking a shot wasn't just pulling a trigger. It was an open invitation for immediate, deadly counter-battery fire right down into their exposed turret. It's basically like sitting in an open convertible in the middle of an artillery barrage.
Right, so let's bring it back to that freezing hilltop on December 1st. Rose is calculating this massive, steep, curving arc to try and drop an M82 armor-piercing round onto the Panther's thinner side armor. He has his hand on the firing mechanism, trusting a glass reticle that is being pushed way past its engineered limits. At 2.6 miles, he absolutely needs ranging shots. So he fires. Boom! The first shot screams across the countryside and strikes the dirt. A miss. The loader shoves a second heavy round into the breech. Rose tweaks his aim by just a microscopic fraction of a degree. He fires again. Closer, but still a miss. Now, with 2 points of reference, he makes one final, perfect adjustment. A third round goes in. He fires.
Now, the physics of this are just staggering.
After the deafening blast and the plume of hot gas roll over the crew, the shell leaves the barrel. And then, they just wait. It takes 6 agonizing seconds for that shell to cross 4,600 yards. 6 full seconds where a gust of wind could push it off course. 6 seconds where the Panther could just turn, or accelerate, or stop.
Now what's really interesting here is that it was 6 seconds of near silence after the gun's thunder, with literally nothing to do but watch and wait. But then, through his optic, Rose finally sees it. A flash of light, a puff of debris. The tank lurched, rolled forward on its own momentum, and just stopped dead. Direct hit. Within minutes, that supposedly impenetrable German Panther was burning under the cold December sky.
It was an incredible moment of precision. But as we know, war changes fast, and just 2 weeks later, the reality for the 814th shifted violently. Look at how rapidly things escalated. On December 1st, we have Rose's calculated master sniper shot, but by December 16th, over 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks absolutely smashed into the American lines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion went from taking calculated long-range shots to being thrown into a brutal, freezing retreat, and they were eventually forced to withdraw from St. Vith by December 23rd.
The contrast here is just wild. On December 1st, they had clear hilltops and miles of sightlines. But jump to mid-December, and the Ardennes forest offered nothing but dense, claustrophobic trees, steep hills, and a freezing fog that cut visibility down to practically nothing. The extreme range capability of the M36? Totally useless here. Crews were suddenly fighting for their literal survival at point-blank range against waves of Panthers and massive King Tigers.
Remember that open-top turret, the one we said was a calculated tactical gamble? Well, in the Ardennes, it became a deadly punishment. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow is literally piling up inside the fighting compartment. You've got gunners trying to turn these metal handwheels with completely numb fingers. The frigid air is turning the hydraulic fluid into sluggish sludge. Loaders are trying to shove these massive, heavy 90mm shells into the breach with frozen hands. It was a freezing nightmare that ultimately pushed the Army to prioritize the fully enclosed M26 Pershing tank.
But despite the chaos that followed, Lieutenant Rose's shot wasn't entirely lost to history, even if it wasn't widely publicized at the time.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an incredible legacy. It was quietly logged away in administrative files in Record Group 407 at the National Archives. And remarkably, his 4,600-yard kill remained the longest confirmed direct-fire tank-on-tank engagement of the entire Second World War. And get this, that record stood unbroken for 47 years. It wasn't until 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, that a British Challenger 1 tank finally beat it, and even then, only by a mere 500 yards.
When you actually compare the technology required to beat Rose's record, what he did in 1944 becomes almost unbelievable. The 1991 Challenger was this fully enclosed digital fortress with thermal imaging, laser rangefinders, and a fire control computer calculating wind and temperature in milliseconds. Lieutenant Rose, he was sitting in an open turret on a freezing hilltop. He had a glass optic with etched lines, hand-loaded shells, and his own brain calculating fractional degrees based on dirt splashes. And he still came within 500 yards of a computerized tank from 3 decades in the future. It's just a stunning reminder of what sheer human ingenuity can accomplish.
You know, Lieutenant Alfred Rose never really became famous. He was just one officer among thousands, and his impossible 2.6-mile shot was buried in a brief, dusty administrative log. Which kind of leaves us with a fascinating thought. If an achievement this staggering sat quietly in a box at the National Archives for decades, what other impossible, unbelievable feats of history are waiting quietly right now, hidden away in archival boxes, just waiting for someone to look?